Well, I want to thank you guys all for coming in this morning. We are about to do a very special panel. But yes, how many of you are good with comic history?
Sometimes.
Awesome. Good thing our panelists are. This works. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the tribute to Charlton Comics. This is where you clap again.
My father's pathetic, I'm sorry.
We should be like giving them coffee on the way in. It's too early in the morning. I'd like to introduce to you the co-editor of the Charlton Arrow, which is going to be the return of Charlton Comics,
Awesome.
Fester Faceplant. We have the editor of Back Issue Magazine, Michael Eury.
Yeah!
And comics writer and historian, Dan Johnson. And I'm going to turn this over to them because they know a lot more about this than I do. So, take it away, boys.
Okay. Which one? Who wants to go first?
Let's talk about the Charlton era.
It's a great comic. I had a chance to flip through it. It looks awesome. So, Fester, tell us all about that.
Well, you know, it started just as really just a whim. I was over on the Ditko-mania Facebook page, and I have a tendency to, whenever I post anything up for Ditko, it usually tends to be something from Charlton. And I ended up schooling a bunch of people there, and someone just offhandedly said, you know what, why don't you just start a Charlton group here on Facebook? And I said, well, I could do that, you know, it'll be me and about 5 other people who remember the company, and it just blew up. I mean, seriously, just insanely blew up. And within, you know, a week, I had a lot of professionals coming in, people who got their start there. You know, Joe Staten and Don Perlin and Paul Kupperberg. And offhandedly, I just said, hey, you know what if I just do a new fanzine? You know, it's been a long time since the Charlton Spotlight, which is the only other fanzine out there. It's been several years since that had come out. And Kupperberg immediately, like within minutes, said, hey, if you're going to do this, I want to write something. And from there, it just blossomed to everybody just saying, how can I be part of this? How can I be part of this? And, you know, John Byrne is like, hey, you know, if you're going to do this, I want to do a pinup, you know. And Rick Stasi's on board, Sandy Carruthers, who did Men in Black, you know, he's like, how can I be a part of this? Bat and Lash. And it just snowballed into, well, what we have here now, you know, almost a year later, and bam, it just shipped this week, and the first printing is already sold out. So I do have a few copies left, but
I love it.
It's already sold out, and we're going back into our second printing next week. So who'd have thunk it, you know? For a company that's been out of business since 1985, it's amazing, and just and no one's getting paid for it. No one, everyone has done this for free, just because either they got their start there or they remember it fondly. Rick Burchett, who's been doing Batman for the last 15 years, his exact quote was, who do I have to kill to be a part of this project? And well, it is what it is, and we're all pretty proud of it, you know, so you guys can take a look at it here in a little bit and judge for yourself, but I think we've done something pretty cool.
Who did he kill?
No one yet, but that's still out on that jury.
I guess as Back Issue magazine editor, I can give you a very quick history of Charlton, because some of you probably don't know what Charlton was. 1948, is that the start date? I think so?
46.
45, okay, 45, ended in 85, but it was a comic book publisher headquartered in Derby, Connecticut. And Charlton published just about every kind of comic you could think of, and whatever was popular at that time, they did a lot of it. So they were, back in the day, kind of considered the #3 publisher after DC and Marvel, and this is long before you had Image or Boom or Dynamite or IDW or anything, you know, other than DC and Marvel today. So they were, again, the #3 for the longest time, and a lot of guys who ended up getting into comics in the 60s, 70s, 80s started at Charlton, and some of those have come back, as he was saying. This book I have, and it's also on my t-shirt, Dick Giordano. Dick, if you're a longtime DC Comics fan, you might remember Dick. He was the executive editor at DC through much of the 80s. And he was an editor there for a while off and on, starting in the late 60s, but he was a Charlton Comics editor. And he worked there in the mid-1960s on what they called the Action Heroes line. The Action Heroes were sort of more reality-based superheroes. A few of them had already been around, like Blue Beetle and Captain Atom. And then they added some new ones with the Action Heroes line under Giordano's watch. Sarge Steel, who was kind of a hard-edged spy with a steel hand. The Question, the Peacemaker, really cutting-edge characters for their day. And in the mid-1980s, Paul Levitz, who was then the he was the executive VP of DC Comics at that point, bought the Charlton superheroes as a gift, essentially, for Dick Giordano, who was then the editorial director at DC. And so Blue Beetle and Captain Atom and all those characters became DC Comics characters. So that's why I have this book up here today. This is a biography that I was honored to do on Dick back in 2004. He passed away a few years ago. But if you are a Charlton and or DC Comics aficionado, come see me later on if you want to take a look at the book.
I did want to add a little bit of what Michael had said. The Action Heroes back in the 1960s, for folks that know their history of comic books, Steve Ditko had the falling out with Marvel Comics, left Spider-Man, left Doctor Strange, and Charlton was the place that he ended up going to. In fact, I think it's been stated several times that was like his favorite company to work for. They basically let him use the style artboard that he wanted, the size that he wanted. They gave him very little restriction, and it's just kind of amazing to see some of the stuff that he was doing at other companies like DC and Marvel, and look at the Charlton stuff he was doing. I know his politics worked a lot more into Blue Beetle and The Question especially. But at the same time, too, you also, if you were a fan of the horror books that he did for Marvel Comics in the 60s, the stuff that he was doing throughout the 70s and all is just amazing stuff. And I know that's what I always think when I think of Charlton. I always think of Steve Ditko. That's the guy I always think of.
Another Action Heroes thing that you may or may not know. Watchmen. Who has read or seen the Watchmen movie?
Both.
Okay. Watchmen was originally going to be Alan Moore's version of the Charlton Heroes at DC. So you look at the Watchmen characters. Let's see. Night Owl was Blue Beetle. Dr. Manhattan was Captain Atom. And essentially, as Dick Giordano explained to me, because he was originally the Watchmen editor, but he was really the executive editor again at DC when they were doing Watchmen, he said to Alan Moore, why do you want to do something so revolutionary to existing characters? Why don't you do characters that are your own? And so that's what they ended up doing. But that template from those characters are still there. And as a matter of fact, next year, in March of 2015, back issue magazine number 79 is called Charlton Heroes in the Bronze Age. We will look at those characters as they appeared in the last days of Charlton in the 80s or 70s and 80s through their joining the DC staff and or DC Pantheon. But Dan has had the honor of interviewing a pretty heavy-hitting guy for that issue.
If I can drop it on.
Oh, please do.
Actually, as I was telling Michael, I finished transcribing the last round of interviews with him last night, and he is right. I was very honored to get a chance to talk to Dave Gibbons about Watchmen. And when you get a chance to read the issue, there's some great history there about the Watchmen series, but also David expressed a great love for the Charlton characters, and Alan Moore did too. Also, in that issue, I just want to double check. He's my editor. I got to double check.
I feel like Dad. He's asking me permission.
I need $50 also. But no, and I just want to double check it. The other article I'm doing for it is a Peacemaker article on Peacemaker, the miniseries with Paul Kupperberg. And we actually tracked down Todd Smith, the artist, on that. And it's interesting because if you look at the Charlton stuff, a lot of it was a little bit more cutting edge than DC and Marvel was at the time. Like I said, Ditko injected his politics. There's a little bit more action and adventure to them. And with Peacemaker especially, Paul had talked about how they got a mandate from DC at the time after Watchmen, make it dark, make it gritty, push the envelope as much as you can. So it's kind of interesting to see how that character kind of was on the envelope of being dark and gritty. So I think they're both great pieces. I've enjoyed transcribing the interviews for both of them. And like I said, I know a lot of what's going to be in that issue for Charlton. It's going to be some great stuff. So you guys get a chance to take a look at it, you're going to love it.
I think one of the, when you were getting back to the Watchmen, one of the reasons they ended up actually switching that out for new characters was they had just acquired the characters, and they're like, well, we have them, let's do something with them, but you want to kill them off. So, that's just bad business sense. So we ended up getting a whole new round of characters, which is fine with me. And although some, I guess, would argue that it might have been better for the characters to kill them off, considering what some of the things have been done with them. But yeah, but that actually goes back to Kupperberg. We call him Killer Kupperberg around where we are because he has a tendency to kill basically everybody off. If you guys don't know, in the news right now, he's killing off Archie in his Life with Archie series. So that's everything that we do is just. We ask him, he's like, oh, I've got this great story coming up. I'm like, well, who dies in it? Who are you killing off this time? So, and if you read the first story in here with Rick Stasi and Kupperberg, there's a whole lot of death in it. So, there's somebody dying on every single page, almost every panel. So, it's actually his answer to The Watchmen. So if you read it, you'll it's an ending to the Captain Adam story that finally saw print in Charlton Bullseye in the late 70s or mid 70s that had originally been planned for 1967 or something like that. And it's a continuation of that, and basically his, let's keep it PG, to the Watchmen, his reaction to that. But it's, I think that was all I had to say really. Can I have the keys to
One cool thing about Charlton Comics back in the day was it was a place where they did everything. And Marvel and DC, the editorial offices were the editors, essentially the production artists, the suits, the business people. And the creative people would come in and out of the offices, but at Charlton, they actually printed their comics there. They had a big headquarters in, as I said earlier, Derby, Connecticut, and they kept those printing presses rolling all the time. They did magazines like Song Hits or something like that. Yeah, exactly. They had lyrics of popular songs in a magazine that you would go buy. So that's the kind of stuff that they were also doing. So they produced everything right there under one roof. And in the 70s, when I discovered Charlton, which was really after the Action Heroes Day, but Charlton was probably the source at that time that was doing licensed comics. So they had the Flintstones and Yogi Bear and cartoon stuff. They had the $6 Million Man and Bionic Woman. And John Byrne got his early start on something called Wheelie and the Chopper Bunch. Anybody watch Wheelie and the Chopper Bunch on Saturday mornings? John Byrne drew that comic for a while. Speed Buggy. A lot of Hanna-Barbera stuff that they were doing back then during the day. And one of the comics that they did that I think really started to give them some creds for originality was E-Man. E-Man was created by Nicola or Nick, is it Cuddy? Cuddy, okay, and Joe Staten. And Joe had been drawing some horror comics and a few other things there and he's now the artist for Dick Tracy. But E-Man was sort of a sci-fi plastic man in a way. He was pure energy. Yeah, and had a girlfriend named Nova. And it was just a really weird little comic that that had a quirky edge to it. and a sense of humor, but it didn't take itself too seriously, but it wasn't a total farce either. And E-Man has been revived a handful of times. I got to edit an issue of E-Man for Comicon back in the late 80s, so it's been, but it was at First Comics for a while as well.
And E-Man is coming back. They've agreed to do a new story, and they'll be back for a 3-issue run. Very soon.
Very awesome. What Michael was talking about Charlton doing a wide variety of books. When I first got into collecting comics, I was about 9 years old. That was back in '79, and I'm going to be an old fart for a second. I always tell people that was like the last great era for comic brands, because it wasn't just all superheroes. You have a wide variety of stuff. And I remember Charlton. It was great because you'd have horror books, you had westerns, you had funny animals, you had war books. And at that time, mid-80s, early 80s, mid-80s, DC was the only one still doing some western stuff and still doing some military stuff. And I don't think anybody else was doing funny animals because Gold Key had gone under by that time. And I do remember in '84 finding, I think the last character that Ditko had done there, which was Static. It was like a 2-issue run of a superhero series. So and again, they were doing a wide variety of stuff. And I do remember as a kid reading the adaptions they did for like $6 Million Man, Space 1999, Emergency. If you're watching ETV, that was on there also. Neil Adams, yeah.
That was all gone through continuity.
Yeah. But no, it was one of those things where you couldn't pigeonhole. You couldn't just say they were just superheroes, they were just horror. Literally anything and everything, there was something for everybody. And I think that was one of the great strategies they had, is that there was something that everybody could come in and say, hey, this is what I like, this is what you'll like, this is what that guy over there is going to like. And it's, it's my personal opinion, it's something I think is missing from comics today, but again, that's just me being an old fart, so.
Let me open up this book. I'm going to get a refresher here. I will tell you a few of the titles that Charlton did back in the day that you maybe had never heard of. Let's see here. Yeah, thank you. The Cheyenne Kid. Who's got a full collection of Cheyenne Kid comics in here? Fester. Let's see. First Kiss. Romance comics. Are you folks... Now, be honest, raise your hand if you've never heard of a romance comic and have no idea what I'm talking about. Okay. And I thought as much, but back in the 40s, Jack Kirby and Joe Simon, two of the legendary creators of comics of all time, created comics for girls. They were romance comics. They basically, like Young Love, I think, was the very first one. And there was a whole line of these, and they ran through the mid-1970s from different publishers. The romance comics were essentially stories, usually about this girl who had this thing for this guy. And oftentimes that guy happened to be some connection to her roommate or something. So there's always some girl in the foreground of a cover or a panel with a tear streaming down her face. If only Johnny would notice me, or something like that. So there are these little fables for girls to essentially keep the women in the kitchen, because they kind of came from this era of post-World War II. Women had been liberated during World War II in Rosie the Riveter. They were in the factories. They were playing baseball. Seen that movie, League of Their Own, about 20 years ago? Women had been freed when men were overseas in World War II. So now that the men were back home, it's time to get them back at home and have them make babies and cook dinner again. I don't mean to make light of this, but this kind of was the philosophy. So these comics spread these stories because they had advice comics and columns in them as well, but they were all written by middle-aged Jewish and Italian men in New York City. So, you might have thought you were getting advice from, Cynthia Trueblood, whatever, but no, you were getting advice from, Vinnie Scarparelli, who, and that's pretty much what was going on. So, those were very popular for the longest time, and Charlton had quite a few of those, and First Kiss was one of them.
And that's something that's actually one of the biggest appeals of Charlton, was their sheer diversity of genres. I mean, they touched on things that no one would release, and certainly for years and years after the big two had given up on romance was one. They ran romance comics all the way up to 1983, you know, and the war comics and the horror comics long after everyone had given them anthologies don't sell. Well, you know what they did for Charlton, because their bread and butter was not the hardcore comic book fan, but the person who walked in off the street and saw it on the rack at the 7-Eleven and was an impulse buy. It's like, you know what, these aren't characters that are happening every month over and over and over again. I'm not invested in them. I don't have to get invested in them. I can read 3 stories for a quarter. Boom, it's in my pocket, you know, and I can throw it away when I'm done. Or, you know, what do you know, there's a comic book that's, and you see some of the numbers, you know, their sales figures, and you go, you open up the book and you see 250,000 copies, you know, and, you know, Marvel these days would kill for those kind of numbers. I mean, it's insane, you know, and even like in the 50s where they were selling, you know, 1 million copies a month of certain titles. It's, I mean, for titles that they considered a throwaway, because as you said, you know, they were literally, the only reason they made comic books was to keep their presses running. It was cheaper to print comic books on the night shift than it was to shut the presses down. And that's why when you buy some of these books, you know, there's off registration pages, you know, sometimes it's just one page with just yellow on it, or there's like no staples, or you've got a cover with the wrong interior, or, you know, the pages haven't been trimmed at all, they're inside out, or you've got 3 covers on one book. And that's one of the appeals of these books, is you don't know what you're going to get. You know, you buy a slab Charlton and you decide to open it up, and you could have, you know, the Merry Mailman instead of, you know, Yellow Jacket comics, and there's your book from, you know, $500 to $20 right there. So it's one of the appeals right there, and people are still wanting. I think that's something that's really missing, and that's why a lot of people are coming back to doing this. You know, they're saying, you know, where else am I going to go to write a Western? You know, I've been in the business for 30 years. I can't write a Western. You know, Mort Todd took this on and said, you know what, let's do this, and let's get this out there, and it's insane. You talk about, you talked about the early days of Charlton, and the 2 founders, both named Charles, they both had sons named Charles, actually met in prison for white-collar crimes. The first guy, Charles Santangelo, or John Santangelo, for doing his songbook lyrics without, you know, rights permissions. And, you know, he met a lawyer there, his cellmate, and he said, look, you got a good thing going, do it right. I got some connections, you know, and there's mob talk there. And he's like, let's do it right. We do it all ourselves. We start from the guy in the cubicle with the typewriter. We send it over to the artists, the inkers, the color separators. From there, we can ship it right downstairs to the printer, into our trucks, and we have our own distribution. Boom, from here to there, right out the door, all in one operation. And from that, they could afford to print, you know, 3 times as much as the other guys could, you know, just because. Well, they also use the cheapest paper possible, you know. But hey, when it's all under one roof, it's easy enough to do, you know.
I was going to say, I know that's another thing about Charlton history also, is that they were very good about holding off on raising their prices. As I recall, they were the last ones to go from 10 cents to 12 cents. And I can still remember when DC was going to 75 cents and Marvel was going to 65 cents, they were the only ones that were still doing 60 cents. And it didn't last for too long, but again, if you're a kid out there with your allowance and you ain't got a lot of money, it's more bang for your buck.
And all you people hearing about 10, 12, 15, 30-cent comics are saying, like, man, I just paid $3.99 for that new book I bought the other day. But yeah, that used to drive people crazy when the price increases went up back then.
10 cents is a lot of money when you're 15 years old.
10 cents was a lot of money when you're 15 back then particularly. But Fester mentioned that the production quality was kind of iffy on a lot of the Charlton comics. And you know how comic books will generally, even today, have kind of a glossier paper stock on the covers. That usually wasn't the case with it was a little harder, but it didn't have that kind of glossier. It didn't have a sheen to it like so. They're a little more bare bones. But again, that's sort of the charm of some of that. Now, I want to ask you something. A question that was asked me a minute ago. There were a lot of horror anthology books at Charlton through the 60s and 70s, stuff like the mini Ghost of Dr. Graves or whatever. Like these books had a host. And are those characters in the public domain? Are they owned by someone or what?
They are, in fact, in the public domain. They're all in here in a horror host story. What's become to them of them, and like Winnie the Witch, Baron Werewolf, Dr. Graves, Countess Von Blood, and they are all in the public domain. And in fact, Charlton was probably the first to use a continuing horror host, The Old Witch, probably 8 years before EC, and yeah, they did that in like 1945, I believe, and EC had The Old Witch in 52, something like that. So yeah, and they've been doing it since almost the very beginning, and so if you guys are writers, we're always looking. But you said you guys had mentioned Ditko, and who actually got his start there, and continued to work there literally throughout the entire existence of the company, because one, as you mentioned, complete total editorial freedom. No one touched his work. You know, he sent it in. He could put it on any size page he wanted. If he wanted to draw it twice up, that's fine, or even 3 times up, that's fine. They'd work with it. He could put it in. He could turn it in. No one would say, well, you got to change this or you got to change that, and he would take the lowest rates in the industry, absolute lowest rates in the industry. In 1975, if you were a writer, you were getting $5 a page, you know, which is even ridiculous even for 1975. And for artists, they were getting $15 to $20 a page, which is, you know, for 75 ridiculous as well. But if you wanted to break into the industry, that was a good place to start. And as you guys said, you know, so many people got their start there. Another thing they did, and they pioneered the practice of painted covers. Pat Boyette found a guy in Texas who had worked out a way to get paints reproduced onto the covers that would not blur or lose their crispness. And that's something that they ran with from like 1973-ish all the way up until around 78, when the whole paper glut and everything just kind of like died out. But and these are guys who are turning in beautifully rendered paintings for $20, you know. And any other person would go, okay, well, I'll just do a quick line drawing, boom, 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 send it off, and it's only $20. But these guys were really behind it. And if you look at these are masterful works of art, especially Boyette. And you know, Byrne turned in a couple. Joe Staten was brilliant at it. Tom Sutton, I mean, ungodly Tom Sutton. He mentioned in one interview that he also could do whatever he wanted. That he would get, you know, a letter or a telegram from Nick Cuddy saying, send us one of your weird ones. So he would just, here's 8 pages, and boom, there it was. You know, just insanely good. If you get a chance, check out the painted covers.
Well, I was going to say, that's one of the advantages, and I know that's what Ditko had always said, is the whole idea that you're not getting paid a lot of money to do this stuff, but you got a lot of personal freedom. And I know there's all these horror stories going around now about DC Comics, about the interference that they've had with creative teams and all. And I know folks that are working in the industry, they say it's maddening. It's like no matter how much money you're getting paid, it's not worth it, because you've got last minute changes and you've got these weird requests that you know are going to screw up your stories. And so, no, I'll be honest with you, I can imagine if you're only getting paid $5 a page, it's still going to be wonderful to know that what you've written is yours and nobody's going to be able to touch it. And just kind of touching on the horror books just a little bit, that was actually my introduction to Charlton books. I had a godmother that used to bring me all her old comic books. And it was like Superman and Batman, and then one day I came home and had a stack of horror comics. And it was all Charlton, maybe a couple of DCs. And I'll be honest with you, those things freaked me out when I was a kid. I was like 8 years old when I was reading through them, and they just, it kind of shook me a little bit, because there's some weird stuff in there, but you go back there a couple of years later and you read through it, and it's like, it's just beautiful stuff. It's beautiful, amazing stuff. And I think it really kind of tied in with the whole idea of the horror host, because that's when Shock Theater was on the air. You had all these old Universal films that were being shown on local TV stations. And, Famous Monsters was still very popular at the time. You had these little horror booms, and I think the 70s, when the Charlton horror comics were really big, was one of those boom periods. Because Universal was getting the Shock Theaters out, you had a whole new generation of horror hosts coming out. You had films like The Exorcist and Night of the Living Dead that were coming out, and you were doing more and more revivals. So yeah, I think they were really able to tap into what was popular at that time.
Do we have any questions about Charlton Comics? From the guy screaming out in the hallway. Yes?
What about Yang? The Kung Fu guy?
Yang. In the 70s, everybody was Kung Fu fighting.
I mean, the Bruce Lee films were hot at that time. Kung Fu was just coming out. Actually, I had a friend of mine on Facebook that told me I had to mention Yang, so that was for you, buddy.
Beautifully drawn by Warren Sattler. Yes. Warren Sattler, and that goes back to the painted covers. I mean, obviously inspired from the Kung Fu series, straight down to the bald head, but it was actually one of their better titles from any of the decades, and just incredibly rendered covers that were painted in watercolors, and you just don't see that now. And incredible stories. In fact, Yang is probably the only comic book that they did that had a crossover with another character. Mauser was the head of backups.
Yeah.
So yeah, but and that actually had a spin-off, which was House of Yang, drawn by Sang-ho Kim, who is a Korean and literally now is like considered a national treasure in that country, and it's amazing to see some of the work he put into that for so little money, and just, well, I think that answers the question. I don't know.
Is that character domain?
It is domain, and we actually are doing something with that Yang Gang. And it's going to be Yang teamed up with other 1800s Western heroes, Cheyenne Kid, Kid Montana, Annie Oakley, a few other things. And that is being written by Roger McKenzie, who I got him out of retirement. He had not written a comic book story in 23 years. And he saw that Kupperberg was on board, and he's like, you know what, this is Charlton. I can have the opportunity to do something I've never ever done. I mean, he got a bad taste in his mouth from Marvel, and which we won't really go into here. But he just gave up, And 23 years later, he's like, "This is pretty cool, Everyone loves Charlton, at least our age does." And so, yeah, to answer your question, Yang is coming back.
And the reason there was Yang, again, it goes back to one of the things we said early in the panel, that Charlton was always quick to capitalize on whatever trend there was elsewhere, and particularly with other comics. So, say Dick Giordano again, he was an illustrator who became an editor, but some of the earliest work he was doing at Charlton were hot rod comics in the 50s, because hot rod movies were really popular. And then that hot rod culture started to permeate television in the 60s, and that's why you had the coolest Batmobile ever, Adam West driving that. There's still all the variations afterwards or before it. That is the coolest car of all time. And let's see, the Munsters. Not only they had the Munsters hearse wagon, but Grandpa Munster had a hot rod coffin car as Dracula. So this was like really part of the culture. So if something like that was going on, Charlton would have not one title, probably 5 titles. And they were out there to capitalize on that trend as much as they could, as quickly as they could. And when it died away, they'd have something else.
Actually, Professor, there was one thing I was wanting to ask you about. And we were talking about the fact that Charlton had all their distribution in-house, which was kind of a rarity at the time, the fact that they were actually producing their own books, getting them out there themselves. It's something that a friend of mine had mentioned to me one time before, and I was wondering if you could answer this question for me. He was talking about how the books go really, really well out on the West Coast because apparently they weren't distributed that far. Most of it was on the East Coast, in the Midwest, and throughout the entire run of the books, especially in the 60s and 70s, you didn't get a lot of distribution out west.
I actually don't know. I've talked with some people who were out there and said we couldn't get them, we're like out in the middle of the country, Kansas or something like that. Distribution spotty at best. Certainly on the West Coast, you may have to go to the next town over to find a Charlton, and they may have like an issue or two. I actually never had that problem. I grew up in Northern Virginia, and in the 70s, my local newsstand literally carried every single Charlton title. Couldn't always get X-Men. I couldn't always get my Conan, but if I was in there for a Charlton, and I asked them about that, maybe 10 years later, I'm out of high school, but at this point, there's actually a comic book store now. And I go into the newsstand and he's still carrying every single Charlton title. And I ask him, I'm like, why do you carry these, but you don't carry, these big sellers like X-Men or wherever? And he's like, because I always sell out. I sell out of my Charlton. I never have to send, it's very rare that I actually have to send any back. I'm like, why do you think that is? He's like, because they're for the casual reader. Which goes back to their bread and butter, And I think that's really what killed Charlton was going to direct sales. Cutting off their entire means of real distribution, which was the mom and pop stores, the 7-Elevens, the grocery stores. You could go into a Safeway or whatever, and they're on the spinner rack, three whole rows of Charltons to choose from. You can't get that anymore. So.
I was going to say one of my favorite stories. This is something we talked about on the back issue Facebook page, which I would highly recommend if you love back old comic books, especially 70s, 80s. Check out the back issue Facebook page. One of the discussions we've had is basically how if you were short on money and you couldn't quite afford the comic book that week, you'd find creative ways to hide it at the store so you could go back next week and actually get it. And I remember when I was looking for comic books in the early 80s, you would find a lot of Charlton books that were like 4 or 5 months old. And it was just, again, you'd find like a Battlefield, or you'd find, I think that first Static issue was one of them. And it was just like mixed in with some of the DCs or some of the Marvels. And I don't know if it was just that they just didn't send them back, or like you said, if they were always sold out, they just thought, well, we've already sold out the Charleston, so we're going to send it back. But I think the oldest one I ever found was one that was like 6 months old. It was cover dated in March, and it was in December when I found it. So, I don't know, it's one of those little pleasures you don't get with comic book stores today, I think.
Distribution really was a whole different animal back then. I mean, today, you essentially go to your comic book shop, and if they haven't ordered your book, all you have to do is say, I want you to order this, and they will order it for you. But back then, in the 70s in particular, and that's probably the era we're all kind of, cross-pollinated on there, you would have to go to, okay, my hometown is Concord. So my first job after school was working at Williams Candy Kitchen, which was a newsstand, grill, ice cream place, all of the above in downtown Concord. And they had this awesome comic book rack. So that's why I had to work there, because I've been going there for years to buy my comic books, or as my dad called them, my funny books. And they had the best selection in the community, but they still didn't stock every single thing. And so sometimes I'd have to go to a 7-Eleven or a newsstand in Kannapolis nearby to make sure that I got all of the things that I wanted. And there was no internet or diamond previews to tell me what I wanted. You had to read the house ads or the bullpen bulletins or whatever in the respective magazine to say, oh, I didn't know that existed, so what's not at my store. So yeah, there really wasn't a one-stop shopping source for every comic you wanted. But then again, there was kind of this thrill of the hunt, you know, and it's like when you're in there looking for a comic. And that was the way it was just, you know, every week for a kid reading comics. You were trying to track them down. When I worked at Williams Candy Kitchen, I have to confess here that I always, I'm a DC guy still. I read a lot of Charltons, a lot of Marvels, other publishers. I worked at DC Comics for a while. I would take my favorite DCs and rack them in the front. And I started to push some of my, well, I pushed the romance comics in the back too. Some Marvels I didn't care for. And Charltons, and it was E-Man that really grabbed me. And that was the first Charlton that I actually put up there right next to a Neil Adams drawn cover on a Batman. So, and that one really helped me look at this company. And that one was just trailblazing again for its time.
And you talk about that, with being on riding the trends. In fact, they were always not just riding the trends, but sometimes right there on top of it before it happens. Like with their war books, they were literally the first people to write about the Korean conflict or the Vietnam War as they were happening. You know, the other war series, you know, from the other companies, they weren't touching it, you know. I mean, Vietnam was a touchy subject for a lot of people, but, you know, Charlton's, they jumped right on it. And I actually just pointed out something yesterday, and this goes back to your licensing thing, where they licensed, you know, Conga and Gorgo. You know, they didn't get Godzilla or anything like that, but they did get Gorgo and Reptilicus, which, you know, they lit labs and Reptosaurus. And you look at it, and it's 1962, and I'm looking at the social commentary in it. You know, I mean, the quote is something like, "You cannot, no people can be forced to bend to your will for whatever reasons of race or." And I'm thinking, my God, this is social commentary, and this is just at the very, very beginning of the Marvel Age of Comics. They literally had maybe a dozen issues out at that point. You know, 6 Fantastic Four, a couple of Thors, and a couple of Ant-Mans, and maybe 2 Hulks at that point. You know, literally maybe 12 issues, and this was certainly before they got their feet wet and with what they're come to be known for. You know, but I mean, we're talking, you know, years before that, and that's one thing that people don't seem to realize. I pick these up and I'm like, really? I just thought these were just throwaway books, but there's actually something to be heard in a lot of these stories, you know.
Well, I was going to say, I think that kind of goes back to the whole idea of you're not getting paid a lot of money, so they're not really paying too much attention to what you're writing. So, yeah.
Which way they were able to start the comics code a lot.
Well, you guys have hit it on the head there. It's essentially they were under the radar. And again, that's why I think did go back when he could have done, you know, things elsewhere. I mean, he went from DC. I mean, the famous comics history thing is Steve Ditko was the co-creator of Spider-Man, of course, and the original Spider-Man artist. And a lot of what you think of as Spider-Man isms came out of this guy's mind and pencil, excuse me. And eventually, after 3 years on Spider-Man, he walked away from Marvel, but he is notoriously reclusive. If Steve Ditko were a guest at this convention, he would not be up here with a microphone in his hand. He just for years has just rarely ever spoken about his work. He lets his work speak for itself. And so he also has been, as you said earlier, very political in his viewpoints. He's pretty conservative and hard right. And some of his characters, like a creator-owned character he did, Mr. A, really showed that. But he is also presumably the kind of creative personality type that would want to go somewhere where they leave him alone. And so with that freedom, he really created some great stories, and his art's always been quirky. I mean, he also was the guy who was the first artist for Doctor Strange. And now Doctor Strange is about to, in a couple of years, make the leap to movies. And so hopefully they're going to pull stuff off of the Steve Ditko page with this surrealistic, world where Doctor Strange is, hopping through dimensions and all this stuff. It looks like some bizarre, 60s psychedelic movie. But this guy had this stuff in his head, and it's just amazing now that CGI has caught up with what guys used to only be able to do in pencil.
Well, we were talking about the whole cutting edge thing, going back to Ditko. One of the cool things I always thought was that he came up with Captain Atom, and that was 1959. And that was really at a point where DC was just, they only had the Flash out for like four issues in Showcase. I don't even know if they'd come up with Green Lantern yet. So really you got them coming out with one of the first great superheroes of the Silver Age. And the artwork on those Captain Atom stories, the early ones, is just beautiful stuff. It's very moody, it's very dark at times, but at the same time too, there's a lot of action and adventure in it, and there's a brightness and then there's a happiness to it that, again, you just don't find in comic books. It knew how to walk that line between this is when it's going to look dark and depressing, this is when it's going to be bright and sunny, and it knew how to walk that line, which a lot of books just cannot do these days. Question?
Now, as far as distribution, I don't know, were they a lot overseas? Because in the Duran Duran video Rio, you got John Taylor reading at Charlton Comics. They filmed that in Sri Lanka. So, how were they distributed overseas?
That's a good question. I actually don't know how their distribution worked overseas. I do know that they were overseas. For many years, there was a dual price on their covers, a UK price and a US price, but I'm really not quite sure how they would have worked that. I mean, considering that their distribution was in-house. So that is actually something I should probably look into. More questions?
Oh, and in that video, I mean, he could have carried that comic with him. I really don't know. That's a really good trivia question.
He's sitting there reading it, and then he fantasizes because it's a war comic. And he's and he gets on the beach, he's in,
Fighting Marines.
I think it's fighting army or something like that.
More questions?
Any more questions? Yes, sir.
With this new book, did y'all go back with the original storylines? Because I know some of the characters are on live DC now, correct?
Right. We did not use any DC-owned characters. Everything has been a public domain. This first story, we skirted the issue. We never mentioned anyone by name. We've drawn them in a way that they're recognizable but not infringing upon anything. So you'll know who they are. We just couldn't say who they are.
It's about the legal.
Exactly. But everything else, Spookman, who had one appearance, which apparently was one of Pat Boyette's favorite characters, and never really got to do anything. We brought him back. We've got romance in here too. It's everything, man. We try to celebrate the diversity of the company, and that is probably the best thing there ever was about the company, was the sheer diversity.
Question for you. So it's been established that the characters that were not purchased by DC or someone else were public domain. Now that you have published them, what is the copyright? I mean, have you now, or the collective entity behind your publication now? Do you have a copyright claim now on these characters?
Well, not on the characters themselves. Of course, once they're in public domain, they're always in public domain. We would have a copyright on our version of the character. Blue Beetle itself may be owned by DC, but only a certain version. If you read like the Golden Age Blue Beetle, he's actually completely different. Completely different costume, different origin. His name is spelled there different. It's Dan Garrett with one T. So you have all this entire history of Blue Beetle, which you can use legally. From 1939 all the way up into 1958, I believe. So there's an entire history that you can use with Blue Beetle. Obviously, Captain Atom you can't use, but there are certain characters that were bought back by their creators. John Byrne owns Doomsday +1. He owns Raj 2000. Steve Ditko owns Killjoy. Cuddy and Staten own E-Man and Mike Mauser. So there are a few that we're not allowed to touch, but we're allowed to use because they say we can. John Byrne graciously said, "Hey, can I do something?" And boom, there it is. It's a little heartwarming for me because I gave up on the majors a long time ago. I think the last time I bought one from the big two was '93, so we're talking 21 years ago or whatever. So it's been a very long time, and the Charlton has always been what I came back to. It's what I was comfortable with, and it just seemed like it's not that they tried harder, but they kind of did, just because no one was looking, and because no one was looking, they were able to do some things that you just weren't going to see anywhere else.
I was going to ask, if I'm not mistaken, Ruff and Snyder had worked with Charlton. That's how Snyder and Ditko got hooked up together, right? And for a lot of folks, if you don't know it, Ditko these days does a lot of Kickstarter projects. Publishes a lot of his own work. He just bypasses the majors altogether. And this may be an extreme question to ask, but I've got to pose it to you. Have you guys thought about trying to get in touch with Ditko to see if he would do anything for this?
Well, Mort Todd, who's been instrumental in helping get this out, has worked with Ditko before many times, and he has sent a copy to Mr. Ditko to get his take on it and to see if he'd like to do anything. And one can only hope. I don't expect it, but one can only hope it'll happen.
Well, I know I've heard these stories about Ditko. I don't think money would be an issue to him. I think just the fact that being able to just to be creative and all, and because I've heard the story about the original art pages that Snyder discovered in his apartment. Which, if anybody's ever heard the story or not, the story goes that Ditko was using a piece of artwork as a cutting board, and when his back was turned, Snyder flipped it over and realized it was a piece of original artwork from like a Tales of Suspense or Tales to Astonish. And Ditko showed him a pile of the stuff they had in the corner, and he's basically cutting it up. And this is like, for all you knew, there was like Ditko Spider-Mans, Ditko Doctor Stranges in there, and this is stuff that could be worth thousands of dollars. And basically, that was the only time Ditko ever got belligerent with him. Was like, no, you're not going to look through this artwork, nobody looks through it. And he's just using it, cutting it up. So I'd approach him, I'd say, go for it.
That would be cool. I guess as we wind things down, I would like to not only encourage you to buy Charlton Arrow, but also put on your radars again Back Issue magazine. Overall, we look at comics of the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, but next March, issue number 79 again is a Charlton Heroes in the Bronze Age issue. The cover is actually a cover that was produced by Al Milgrom in 1975 for a fanzine that Charlton published called the Charlton Bullseye. And it's a cover is done, looks like Jim Starlin art, because Al Milgrom and Jim Starlin were working together a lot back then on characters like Captain Marvel and Warlock for Marvel. But this is a Captain Atom versus Ghost cover that was done again and only appeared on that fanzine in black and white, so we were using that in this in color. And we again look at the last days of Charlton's publication of those characters. Then they fell to AC Comics in the 80s, and then early 80s, and then they ended up with DC. So we have extensive articles on the Blue Beetle series that Len Wein and Paris Collins did, the Captain Atom series that Cary Bates and Pat Broderick did. Again, you mentioned Peacemaker, the Dave Gibbons interview. We have a feature in our magazine called The Greatest Stories Never Told, which looks at things that weren't published. And there's one on something called Blockbuster Weekly. And for a while, DC was going to, in the mid-80s, publish a weekly comic book starring Superman and the newly acquired Charlton heroes. So there is a cover that Dave Gibbons did for issue number 1, which never came out, excuse me, which features Superman and Captain Atom and Blue Beetle, all these characters flying at you. And so we're doing a little piece on that. And Bob Greenberger is writing that one, and he was going to be the editor. So yeah, we will continue to, when we can, mine Charlton's history and back issue as well.
I think if there's any more questions, or we're about winding down here. So I appreciate everyone coming out.
Thank you.
So Mike and Dan, thank you.
Thank you.
I was just talking to Fester. He's going to be sitting over with me and Michael in the dealer's room. He's got a limited number of the Charlton Arrows. These are first editions, right?
Yes.
First editions. Sold out. I've looked through it. It's a great comic book. Come on by. How much is it? $7?
$7.
$7. You'll sign in everything. So come on by the table and hey, we can talk more comics there. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
And John Byrne is like, hey, if you're gonna do this, I want to do a pinup, And Rick Stasi's on board. Sandy Carruthers, who did Men in Black, he's like, how can I be a part of this? Bat and Lash, and it just snowballed into what we have here now. Almost a year later, and bam, it just shipped this week, and the first printing is already sold out. So I do have a few copies left, but
I love it.
It's already sold out, and we're going back into our second printing next week. So who'd have thunk it? We're a company that's been out of business since 1985. It's amazing, and no one's getting paid for it. Everyone has done this for free, just because either they got their start there or they remember it fondly. Rick Burchett, who's been doing Batman for the last 15 years, his exact quote was, "Who do I have to kill to be a part of this project?" And it is what it is, and we're all pretty proud of it. So you guys can take a look at it here in a little bit and judge for yourself. But I think we've done something pretty cool.
Dick Giordano. Dick, if you're a longtime DC Comics fan, you might remember Dick. He was the executive editor at DC through much of the 80s. And he was an editor there for a while, off and on, starting in the late 60s. But he was a Charlton Comics editor. And he worked there in the mid-1960s on what they called the Action Heroes line. The Action Heroes were sort of more reality-based superheroes. A few of them had already been around, like Blue Beetle and Captain Atom, and then they added some new ones with the Action Heroes line under Giordano's watch. Sarge Steel, who was kind of a hard-edged spy with a steel hand. The Question, the Peacemaker, really cutting-edge characters for their day. And in the mid-1980s, Paul Levitz, who was then the he was the executive VP of DC Comics at that point, bought the Charlton superheroes as a gift, essentially, for Dick Giordano, who was then the editorial director at DC. And
And I have a tendency to, whenever I post anything up for Ditko, it usually tends to be something from Charlton. And I ended up schooling a bunch of people there. And someone just offhandedly said, you know what, why don't you just start a Charlton group here on Facebook? And I said, well, I could do that, it'll be me and about 5 other people who remember the company. And it just blew up. I mean, seriously, just insanely blew up, and within a week, I had a lot of professionals coming in, people who got their start there. Joe Staten and Don Perlin and Paul Kupperberg, and offhandedly I just said, hey, you know what if I just do a new fanzine? It's been a long time since the Charlton Spotlight, which is the only other fanzine out there. It's been several years since that had come out. And Kupperberg immediately, like within minutes, said, hey, if you're going to do this, I want to write something. And from there, it just blossomed to everybody just saying, how can I be part of this? How can I be part of this?
Well, I want to thank you guys all for coming in this morning. We are about to do a very special panel. But yes, how many of you are good with comic history?
Sometimes.
Awesome. Good thing our panelists are. This works. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the tribute to Charlton Comics. This is where you clap again.
My time is pathetic, I'm sorry.
We should be like giving them coffee on the way in. It's too early in the morning. I'd like to introduce to you the co-editor of the Charlton Arrow, which is going to be the return of Charlton Comics,
Awesome.
Fester Faceplant. We have the editor of Back Issue Magazine, Michael Eury.
Yeah!
And comics writer and historian, Dan Johnson. And I'm going to turn this over to them because they know a lot more about this than I do. So, take it away, boys.
Okay. Which one? Who wants to go first?
Let's talk about the Charlton era.
It's a great comic. I had a chance to flip through it. It looks awesome. So, Fester, tell us all about that.
Well, it started just as really just a whim. I was over on the Dickomania Facebook page, and
Who did he kill?
no one yet, but that's still out on that jury.
I guess as Back Issue magazine editor, I can give you a very quick history of Charlton, because some of you probably don't know what Charlton was. 1948, is that the start date? I think so?
46.
45, okay, 45, ended in 85, but it was a comic book publisher headquartered in Derby, Connecticut. And Charlton published just about every kind of comic you could think of, and whatever was popular at that time, they did a lot of it. So they were, back in the day, kind of considered the number 3 publisher after DC and Marvel, and this is long before you had Image or Boom or Dynamite or IDW or anything other than DC and Marvel today. So they were again the number 3 for the longest time, and a lot of guys who ended up getting into comics in the 60s, 70s, 80s started at Charlton, and some of those have come back, as he was saying. This book I have, and it's also on my t-shirt,